London is not a beautiful city. Under the soot that covers its buildings is a teeming mass of 4 million souls trying to survive, mostly off of each other. You see it in the paper every day. Thankfully, we have the London Times to keep us informed of all these troubling activities with an unbiased eye and razor-sharp accuracy. We find this publication to be of invaluable assistance in our investigations, and I'm sure you will as well. Among the forces of evil which run rampant in this city, there are also, thankfully, 2 groups of individuals who will aid us in our cause. As we do, they attempt to right wrongs and restore harmony and civility to the streets of London. The first of these groups is a ragtag association of young ruffians. I call them the Baker Street Irregulars. Don't let them fool you. They may be scruffy and ill-bred, but they are on the right side of the law. They can go everywhere, see everything, and overhear everyone. They are my eyes and ears in the streets of London, unquestionably a tremendous asset in our work. They will help us in our investigations if they can. The other group is a far more civilized collection of gentlemen and institutions. I call them the Baker Street Regulars. They, too, will be extremely useful in our work. At the start of any investigation, do keep in mind that it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Unwittingly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. The people and places to whom I will now introduce you will help us to collect the facts. May we use them wisely. Come, the game's afoot.
What rubbish! What balderdash!
You must have read something terribly disturbing, Watson, for you to be so overwrought this early in the morning.
Indeed, Holmes. It's irresponsible of the Times to play upon people's superstitions.
Ah, you must be referring to the affair of the mummy's curse.
Has the entire city in an uproar. 3 men dead, and they expect us to believe that the 4,000-year-old mummy was the murderer. I'm surprised you haven't taken some interest in this case, Holmes.
To the contrary, my dear Watson. I have made some inquiries, because I dare say I do believe this murderer is a much younger chap.
It's quite amusing, all this hoopla over a mummy's curse, I must say. Not so amusing, of course, the murder of 3 Englishmen.
Have any of your reporters uncovered anything new?
Actually, I've been in Paris the past several weeks. Just returned to London on Tuesday. I've had no involvement with the writing of any of these articles. I believe they are all the work of Philip Travis. He's one of our young reporters. For a short time, he was the Egyptian correspondent.
Was he sacked?
No. He returned to London just a few days ago. I gather he was reassigned to cover the case from here because he had some familiarity with the murder in Egypt.
Do you know Travis?
No, never actually met the chap, although I hear he's a bit of an odd duck.
Thanks for your help, Henry.
Anytime. Let me know when you catch the mummy. That's one scoop I'd like to get.
So you've been reading my articles in the Times. I'm honored. What do you think of them?
Quite interesting. You've clearly been following the murders quite closely. Who do you suspect?
I believe it is the work of the ancient Egyptian god Tumatef and his goddess Neith.
Be serious.
I couldn't be more serious. You see, Mr. Holmes, although I am a journalist, I was actually trained as an Egyptologist. I know all about these mysteries. That's why my articles carry the force of truth.
And what is the truth, Mr. Travis?
The truth is that the Egyptians discovered the secret of life. What we call science is mere child's play compared to the knowledge they had. Look at this. Do you know what this is?
It appears to be a mummified animal of some sort, a monkey, perhaps.
Precisely.
Write a conversation piece.
I've been using it in some very important experiments which, if successful, will unlock the secret for bringing back the souls of the dead. I've been working on it, Mr. Holmes, using these tanner leaves. Watch. Uma Lotus. Licantina. Burura.
It appears that the soul of this particular monkey has no intention of making a reappearance.
It's only a matter of time. I know it is. After all, these secrets have been buried for thousands of years. These things don't happen overnight. But it will happen someday. This is my mission.
I believe I'll leave you to your work, Mr. Travis.
Don't go yet. Let me show you more.
Thank you. Some other time, perhaps.
Now, the thing what does strike me as odd is the passenger list of the Eastern Empress. Now, I'm not saying it has anything to do with the mummy murders, mind you, but it was a bit out of the ordinary.
What was Hogg?
Akram Farmi, for starters. He's a well-known importer, he is. For a considerable price by all accounts, he can acquire whatever one's heart desires, be it jewels, art objects, or even wild animals, if that's what you fancy. I'd say he was on board that ship to transport something very valuable.
The presence of one high-powered importer on a London-bound vessel is hardly reason for suspicion.
Right-o. But Abdullah al-Saad was also on board.
Oh, yes. The well-known agent for the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire.
You never miss a trick, do you, Holmes? Well, whatever it was what Farmi was carrying, I'd say it was something those Turks wanted to get their hands on. Hello? Is anyone there? Mr. Farmi, are you at home?
Apparently so, Watson. Look.
Oh, what ghastly business. Everyone will assume the mummy has struck again.
Hardly a plausible assumption. This poor fellow has a knife in his back and not a scrap of sheeting about his neck.
How very observant, Holmes.
Ring up Scotland Yard. This case is simple enough for them to solve.
You've solved it already.
Elementary, my dear Watson. Obviously, it was the butler.
Butler? What butler?
Exactly my point. A man as wealthy as Akram Farmi would always have a manservant about him. After the foul deed, this one obviously beat a hasty retreat.
Beg your pardon, but could I have a word with you, Sir Jasper?
Dr. Watson, of course. Are you investigating the death of Samuel Sneed? I just finished with him.
No, we're interested in James Winterbank.
The mummy's latest victim, of course. Who hired Holmes for this one? King Tut?
That's a jolly good one. Actually, we don't have a client on this one.
Just for fun, eh? Well, about the only thing I can tell you is that mummy has very powerful hands.
What do you mean?
The trachea was crushed along with one of the vertebrae of the neck. Death was instantaneous. Snap.
But the papers' reports say that there were mummy wrappings found round the neck.
Just window dressing. Without question, it was bare hands. The bruises and the way that the vertebrae was crushed leave no doubt about that.
Thank you very much for your time, Sir Jasper. We're very much appreciative.
Not at all, Watson. You will let me know when you've convicted the mummy.
Beg your pardon?
Well, so I can perform an autopsy on him. Would be most fascinating, don't you think?
Pettigrew wrote this book over 50 years ago, and there's still nothing better on the subject. Fascinating. Just fascinating. And what can I do for you today, Whitson?
It's Watson, sir.
Watson, yes, of course.
We're interested in what you may have learned about this mummy case.
Oh, so these days it's mummies you're chasing down with that fella Holmes.
It's Holmes, sir.
This is what it said now, isn't it, Whitson?
Yes, I believe you did, sir.
Let me show you what I found so far. This is the bit of linen that was found round the neck of James Winterbank. I examined it thoroughly, and it is quite old, perhaps thousands of years. However, it is not the murder weapon.
Are you certain of that?
Aye. The linen is quite old, but it's not at all strong enough to strangle a grown man.
Very interesting, sir.
I also found something quite fascinating. Take a look through this glass. Do you see those short hairs on the fabric?
They look precisely like hairs.
Of course they look like hairs. But what kind of hairs? They're not human hairs. They're dog hairs. Now, look at this. This piece of linen was found round the neck of the victim on board the ship. Well, his name was Leatherby or something. It is also quite old, and on it I found more hairs. More dog hairs? No, my dear man, monkey hairs. I've not yet been able to identify the precise species, but it's just extraordinary, isn't it?
Quite. But what do you think it all means?
Well, I'm not the sort who likes to jump to conclusions, Whitson, but I can assure you that neither of these bandages were the murder weapons.
I'm very sorry to intrude on you in your moment of grief.
Oh, that's quite all right. You know, Andrew and I haven't been married very long.
Long enough to know if he had any enemies?
Oh, Andrew was so unassuming. Everyone liked him.
Including Mr. Urubaru?
I really loved my husband.
I'm sure you did. Oh, English toffee. My favorite.
Would you like one?
Please.
Sorry. You'll have to open this yourself. I've never been any good with these things.
I know only a very little about two of the unfortunate gentlemen. I do recall that Turnbull was quite an eccentric chap. I don't believe he ever married, nor did he take his rightful place in London society.
And what of Windybank?
A quiet academic sort, as far as I can tell, married to a woman called Hildegard. There was one spot of controversy that I can recall. It seems a few years back he had a run-in with the Anti-Vivisectionist League.
No, but of course.
It seems that during a lecture on the advancement of science, he spoke of the autopsy of his own pet, a recently deceased Yorkshire Terrier. Well, I can tell you the Times received a great deal of letters to the editor condemning him on that one. Even one from a Louise Fenwick, who threatened to vivisect him.
Oh, dear. Well, then I surmise it's Weatherby you know nothing about.
Well, now that you mention it, I believe he was assisting Professor Windybank in that lecture series.
Such a tragedy. Fine men all, and such outstanding scholars. I still can't quite get over the shock of it.
We understand.
Professor, we're looking for background information on these three men so that we can understand how their murders might tie together.
Well, let me begin with Dr. Turnbull. Ebenezer Turnbull was responsible for organizing the Carteret expedition. Quite a remarkable man, really. This was the first time he teamed up with James Windybank. Professor Windybank was one of our most popular lecturers. In fact, several of his former students were also eager to accompany him. I recall him saying that he was having difficulty choosing. Weatherby turned out to be the lucky one. Though it seems far from it now, doesn't it? I suppose Smith and Travis turned out to be the lucky ones after all.
Smith and Travis?
Peter Smith accepted the invitation to join another expedition. As for Philip Travis, he was quite keen on accompanying Professor Windybank. In fact, he became exceedingly upset when Andrew Weatherby, a postgraduate student in the department, was chosen instead. Took it rather personally, I should say.
Windybank's body was found in the mummy's case.
Inside it?
Precisely. One of the guards, Henry Witherspoon, discovered it when making his rounds. He noticed that the lid was askew and a hand was sticking out of it. By the look on his face when he came to summons me, he must have thought that the mummy was attempting to leave its resting place. Some of the guards have been a bit on edge, you know, since the stories about Dr. Turnbull's death.
What happened when you arrived at the scene?
Witherspoon assisted me in removing the lid. And there was the body of James Windybank. Around his neck was a bandage of linen.
And the mummy was missing?
No, it was in there, too. Underneath poor Windybank, completely undisturbed, not a length of its sheeting unraveled.
Who had access to the exhibit room?
Well, the room was officially closed yesterday while we set up the exhibit, but the museum was open and we took no extraordinary precautions to keep people out.
Can you think of anyone who might have wanted to kill Windybank?
None at all. I actually didn't know him very well. He did work for the museum, you see. He was with the London University. The university and the museum were joint sponsors of the Ketterbeck expedition.
Mr. Johnson, can you think of anything whatsoever that might shed some light on this affair?
No. I'm very sorry. I can't think of a thing. I only hope that all this publicity doesn't keep people away from the exhibit.
Dr. Turnbull, he was a strange one, he was. Hardly ever at home, always traipsing about a Lord knows where.
May I take a look at his things?
Oh, suit yourself. All he had is a big pile of books about Egyptian mummies and a few maps. He was a son of an earl, he was. Though you hardly tell from looking at him, poor fellow. Do you really think this mummy thing's what done him in? Creepy, I says.
We had just come through a rather grueling storm, so I sent my first officer, Luther Tenney, down into the hold to check on the condition of the cargo. He reported back post-haste that Mr. Weatherby was lying dead among the Egyptian artifacts we were transporting. I turned over the helm to Tenney and went below to have a look for myself.
And did what you see confirm Teddy's report?
Unfortunately, yes. Weatherby was lying next to that coffin, or whatever it's called, apparently strangled. I went back to the bridge and put Tenney in charge of the investigation.
And what did he uncover?
Well, you'll have to ask him for the specifics, because I can scarcely recall the details.
Let me tell you, a murder, even by a 4,000-year-old mummy, was only one odd thing in a string of bad luck on this voyage.
What sort of bad luck?
It all started with the crew, really. Seamen are a rather superstitious lot to begin with, and the idea of carrying about a 4,000-year-old mummy had them shivering in their timbers. We almost faced a bloody mutiny. Then there were the passengers, a strange lot. I can tell you that reporter fellow, Travis, did us no service at all with his mystic mumbo-jumbo. He and Professor Winterbank had a regular war of words going on about whatever powers this mummy was supposed to have. And there was the two Arabs.
Arabs? Interesting. Do you recall their names?
I should hope I do. One was called Farmy. He always carried around this curious little box. No clue what was in it, but Farmy never let it out of his sight. The other one's name was Al Sard, and he spent most of his time lurking about watching Farmy. My guess is he wanted that box.
Sounds like you had your hands full.
I haven't even told you about the fight yet between Mr. Weatherby and Mr. Urubaru.
Over what?
Weatherby's wife, I'd say, though they were a tight-lipped lot about it.
I see. Tell me, Lieutenant, we understand that you were the first person to discover the body.
Yes, sir, I was. Captain Ramsey sent me down to inspect the hold. I went immediately over to them Egyptian crates. Professor Winterbank was particularly anxious about him, you know.
Could you describe the scene as you remember it?
I'll never forget it. I just made my way to the back of the hold, and I noticed at the top of them crates, the one what carried the mummy's coffin was raised up kind of funny like. The coffin lids laid off to one side, and there was Mr. Weatherby, all sprawled on the floor next to a bowl of ashes. He'd been strangled by a length of the mummy's sheeting. Bloody gruesome, I tell you. Poor bloke's eyes popped out like a couple of sausages on a hot iron skillet.
Quite a vivid picture, don't you agree, Holmes?
Quite. And you reported this to Captain Ramsey straight away?
Absolutely. In fact, the captain put me in charge of the entire investigation.
And what did you discover? Did anybody have any contact with Weatherby on the night of the murder?
Not that I know of. I could account for all the crew. The passengers were in their cabins as far as anyone knew or would say. Nobody saw anything, heard anything, or knew anything. Besides, Weatherby was seasick from the beginning. He stayed pretty much in his cabin all the time. Maybe that's why the lovely young Mrs. Weatherby was gallivanting about.
With Uruburu?
Yes, indeed.
And what of the bowl? Where is it now?
The bowl?
With the ashes.
Oh, yes. You know, now that you mention it, I don't recall ever seeing it again.
Hear ye, hear ye. The Queen's court stands in order. Mr. Holmes, I understand you've been looking into the mummy murders.
Yes, my lord.
Tell me then, who was Ebenezer Turnbull's murderer? I believe we're to choose from either our notebook or the directory, Holmes.
Very good, Watson.
And And what makes you so certain? What was Travis's motive for killing Turnbull? And what of Andrew Weatherby? Who murdered him? So, you say Travis killed Turnbull and Weatherby?
Yes, I believe he did, my lord.
What was his motive to kill Weatherby, Holmes? Ah, revenge. The oldest motive in the book. Now, Holmes, who murdered James Windibank? This Travis seems to be quite a busy fellow. What made him kill James Windibank? Excellent job, gentlemen. You have solved the case to my satisfaction. The court stands in recess. Until next time, of course.
Well, Watson, I believe this case is solved. And for your information, it was not the mummy.
Come, Holmes. I never thought for a moment it was the mummy.
Of course not, Watson. However, the murderer and the mummy did have one thing in common.
What's that?
They both were the only ones present at the time of the murders, except, of course, the victims.
You state the obvious, Holmes.
Ah, but it is seeing the obvious that is important. First, I saw no reason to assume that we were dealing with more than one murderer. Secondly, the locations of the murders limited the number of suspects.
Limited them? The first murder was in Egypt, the second on ship in the middle of the sea, and the third in London. You call the entire populations of London and Egypt a limited number of suspects?
No, Watson. We had to find someone who was in Egypt for the first murder, on the ship for the second, and in London for the third.
Oh, but of course.
According to the newspapers, the Eastern Empress was in Bombay at the time of Ebenezer Turnbull's murder, so that eliminated the ship's crew as suspects. Thus, I needed the list of passengers who boarded the ship at Cairo. It was our visit to Jardine, Mason and Company that provided our first critical clue. From it, I learned that Philip Travis was a passenger. I then learned that Travis was the chap who reported on the first murder. He became one suspect, but I had no motive. Clarissa Weatherby, who was also at the scene of the murder in Cairo, was another possible suspect, since she appears to have had a bit of a dalliance with Mr. Uruburu there on the high seas. So I had found her motive for the murder of Weatherby, but not a motive for the murder of the others.
Then whom did you eliminate?
Mrs. Weatherby. Her hands were not strong enough even to open a jar of English toffee, let alone strangle a grown man.
And what of Travis's motive?
It seems that Travis was a student in the Egyptology department at London University and had studied under James Windibank. He wanted very badly to be chosen as a member of the expedition, but Windibank turned him down. Instead, Weatherby was chosen, and Travis was furious. So there you have the motive for two of the murders.
And what of his motive for the murder of Turnbull?
Evidently, Travis had written a vicious article questioning Dr. Turnbull's credentials to lead the expedition. Turnbull's response was quite harsh, probably powerful enough to drive an odd duck like Travis to murder.
Very impressive, Holmes.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
Society burglar strikes again. Series of burglaries. 6 over the period from June 2nd to June 17th. On July 2nd, the 7th occurred at the home of Sir Sanford Leeds. Cleopatra tiara stolen, it says. As in the other cases, no sign of extensive search by the thief, and only one piece of jewelry involved. Victims elsewhere at the time. Here's a complete list of the particulars, Holmes, if you'd care to read it.
find him in the study.
How do you do, gentlemen? I am Gerald Locke.
Please be seated, Mr. Locke. How can we be of service?
3 days ago, Guy Clarendon was found murdered at Halliday's. It's preposterous, but Miss Frances Nolan has been charged and is being detained at the criminal court, Old Bailey.
Frances Nolan. Ah, yes. Sister of Loretta Nolan. Only surviving heirs of Sir Malcolm Nolan, founder of the Aberdeen Navigation Company.
I seem to recall that Sir Malcolm and Lady Nolan were killed when some lunatic threw a bomb into their carriage. Seems to me that later I heard something about it being a case of mistaken identity. Wasn't one of their little offspring in the carriage with them at the time?
Yes, it was Loretta, Frances's sister. She was only 4. Miraculously, she was uninjured.
Mr. Locke, I've heard that you are a suitor for Miss Frances Nolan's hand, are you not?
Yes.
And was it not also true that she was being courted by Guy Clarendon?
Unfortunately, yes.
Have you any idea why Frances Nolan was charged with the crime?
Well, she was discovered over the body with a pistol in her hand.
That would do it.
But you don't understand. Frances is totally incapable of murder. Not even of a scoundrel such as Guy Clarendon.
Scoundrel? But he's from such blue blood. Also, if I'm not mistaken, he's an accomplished batsman for the West London Cricketers. A ranked fencer in international competition.
He was also a bit of a bounder, Watson.
What an understatement. Guy Clarendon was excessively fond of cards and strong drink. His father had all but disinherited him. I tried to tell Frances that Clarendon was no good, but to no avail. And now look at the mess she's in. Will you help?
Most certainly.
I understand that Wilfred Robards is considering taking Miss Nolan's case. He might be able to help you. If you'd like, I can arrange an interview with Frances Nolan. She's being held downstairs, you know.
We might be able to help you, Miss Nolan, if you could just remember what happened that night in Mr. Clarendon's room.
Well, that's just the trouble. I can't remember anything except seeing Guy's body across the room and the pistol in my hand.
Where did you get the pistol?
I've no idea, though the police assure me it's mine. I didn't know Guy was at Halliday's. I've never even been there before. And why would I shoot him anyway? We loved each other.
There, Miss Nolan. Stiff upper lip.
Thank you.
Miss Nolan, what is the last thing you remember before the room at Halliday's?
Oh, hot cocoa in bed.
I beg your pardon?
Oh, well, every night before I retire, my maid, Grace, brings me a cup of hot cocoa.
How nice.
Yes.
And before that?
Well, before that, I dine with Dr. Trevelyan, as I do every Sunday evening. My sister, Loretta, is under his care. The doctor and I have become good friends over the years. He left at 10 o'clock, as he always does.
May I ask, where did you first meet Guy Clarendon?
At the country estate of Cornelius Oldwine, in March. My sister, Loretta, was attending a party there. I suppose things got a bit out of hand because it seems she dived into a fountain. She caught pneumonia, and I had to go and fetch her home. Guy was also at the estate, and that's where we met.
And he immediately began paying court to you?
Oh, heavens, no. Nobody seems to take much notice of me. I suppose that comes from having such a wildly attractive sister. That's why I was so surprised when he called a few weeks later. We began seeing a great deal of each other. We went on long carriage rides, had picnic lunches. It was all quite lovely. And then on the 5th of June, he declared his love for me and asked for my hand in marriage. I was so happy. I couldn't have killed him.
How do you explain your presence at Halliday's?
Well, I can't. It's just like the other 2 times.
You've had memory losses before.
Yes, twice in the past month. The first time I found myself atop a horse in Hyde Park, with no recollection of how I got there. The last thing I remember was having lunch with my sister Loretta. Then there I was, atop a chestnut mare.
How peculiar.
The funny thing is, I'm terrified of horses.
You mentioned there was a second time.
Yes, a few days later, I met with my solicitor, Hiram Davenport. Then the next thing I know, I'm at the Newgate Street station. I consulted my physician, Dr. Mason, and he was quite as baffled as I was.
One last question, if you will. What is your relationship with Gerald Locke?
Oh, Jerry, he's a dear old friend. Though I'm afraid we had a falling out of late. He said some very unkind words about Guy.
Clarendon, poor chap. He arrived on the 29th day of May and was given a front room on the 3rd floor. 2 days later, he asked to be moved to suite 205.
To your knowledge, did he have any visitors?
Only 2 that I'm aware of. One was a most disagreeable fellow. He was rather large, had a thick walrus moustache, and a very prominent scar down his cheek. He arrived on the 1st of June, the very day of Mr. Clarendon's move. He simply came in, sat down in the lobby, and waited. 20 minutes or so later, Mr. Clarendon came down from his room. The big man yanked him aside. I was about to send for a bobby when Mr. Clarendon signed me that all was well. After a few minutes, they left together. I never saw the man again. His other visitor, who came by quite frequently, was a most striking woman. She was quite fashionably dressed. She had a most distinctive laugh, very full and deep. I've no idea who she was.
Please, tell us about the morning of July 2nd.
It was about 9 o'clock when a woman entered. She was rather plain-looking, and I wouldn't have noticed her, except for the fact that she came in the front door, looking neither left nor right, and proceeded directly up the staircase. It couldn't have been more than 30 seconds later when I heard a bang, followed by a woman's scream. I dashed upstairs to the 2nd floor. The door to room 205 was open. Inside, I found the body of Mr. Clarendon and the woman who'd just come out. She was lying in a swoon in the center of the room with a pistol in her hand. I revived her with some whiskey. When she came to, she was totally disoriented. She had no idea where she was or what she'd done. When she saw Clarendon's body, she let out a shriek and dropped the pistol. I summoned the police.
Tell me, at what hour are the hotel's front doors locked?
Oh, 10 o'clock, sir. Anyone who arrives after that has to be let in by the night staff. Of course, Mr. Clarendon was never one of those. He was always in his room before 10.
May we see his room? What have we here, Watson? Appears to be a bank statement.
Oh, look here, Holmes. Appears the maid missed a spot in her sweeping.
Good thing she did, Watson. You're staring at evidence.
Blood.
What's he stain here?
Smells like a fine sherry. Looks like someone's been celebrating.
The question is, was it with the body or over it?
Nothing much here. A couple of shirts and 3 pair of shoes.
But what you failed to notice, my dear Watson, is that one of the pairs of shoes is canvas and has been dyed black. Interesting. A sweater and trousers. An ensemble in black.
Not much of a view. All I can see is a brick wall of the building across the alley.
Ivy vine winding up a trellis.
This is a difficult thing for a man to say about his only son. But Guy was a wastrel and a ne'er-do-well. Only a short month or so ago, I gave him £5,000 and told him that was the last he'd see of my money. I'd hoped the shock would bring the boy around, make him realize he had to settle down, instead of wasting his life on gambling and gallivanting around with that wild woman.
Which wild woman was that?
Loretta Nolan, of course.
You mentioned gambling, Sir Francis. Have you any idea with whom he gambled or who might have wanted to kill him?
I wish I did. He told us nothing. He only came around when he needed money. And when I told him there'd be no more, we never saw him. Just about broke his mother's heart. There, Gertie. We still have one another.
I've something you ought to know about Master Guy. One morning, rather early, about 4 or 5 weeks ago, I heard a terrible clatter downstairs, so I came down to investigate. It was Master Guy just coming home. He was in a terrible state, all battered and bruised, with a fresh cut on his forehead. I asked him who did it to him, and he wouldn't say. I think he was afraid for his life.
Tell us, who was at home on the evening of the 1st?
Well, just Miss Frances, sir. Oh, yes, of course, and Dr. Trevelyan.
At what time did the doctor take his leave?
Oh, let me think. It must have been 10 o'clock, because that's what time he always leaves.
What did Miss Frances do after her guest left?
What she does every evening, sir. Well, she asked for a cup of hot cocoa, which I brought her straight away. Then she read for a bit by the fire. Later, when I went up to bed, I passed her room, and the light went out.
What time would that have been?
Oh, let me see. Oh, I know, it was 11:30, because the clock chimed. Then I went to sleep. Later, I was awakened in the middle of the night, right in the midst of the most peculiar dream. You see, I was barefoot and trying to buy a pair of shoes,
As fascinating as all this is, could we get back to what it was that awakened you?
Oh, yes, of course. Well, it was something that I heard, or thought I heard. I listened for a bit, but that was the end of it, so I went to sleep again. Later, I awoke at 7:30. I always wake up at 7:30, except, of course, on Sundays when I sleep until 8. As usual, I began to prepare Miss Frances's breakfast. I had no sooner got into the kitchen when I heard the front door open and close. Well, I ran to the front window and peeked out, and there was Miss Frances walking down the street.
And why do you deem that so unusual?
Well, she never leaves before she's eaten one of my currant buns.
Enter and be recognized. Oh, you don't wish to play Her Majesty, eh? Very well.
You do not seem particularly disturbed by the recent turn of events, Miss Nolan.
Each of us grieves in his own way, Mr. Holmes.
It must be difficult for you to face the possibility that your own sister may have killed your dearest chum.
Guy was fun to be with. And as for Frances, I love her dearly, but, well, it's funny to think Miss Right and Proper has finally gotten herself into a bit of a jam.
Miss Nolan, may I ask, when was the last time you saw Guy Clarendon?
Let me think. I believe it was the Richmond's party last Thursday. Yes, I'm sure of it. God, we did cut it up a bit there.
And after the party?
We did not go home together, if that's what you're implying. That would have broken Frances's heart. She was head over heels for Guy, you know. She had some foolish notion that he was going to marry her. Not that someone like him ever would. But I do recall her saying, and it might have been the night of his death, that she was going to have a talk with him about their future.
Doctor, we understand that you dined with Frances Nolan on the evening of July 1st.
Yes, that is correct. We dine every Sunday. Her sister Loretta has been under my care for some 10 years. First at the Mesmer Braid Institute and then in private practice.
Without breaching physician-patient protocol, would you mind telling us the nature of her illness?
She never quite recovered from the overwhelming trauma of watching her parents being blown to bits.
I quite understand.
As is often the case with young orphans, they tend to create fantasies about their parents. Miss Loretta Nolan truly believes that her father was the King of England, making her a princess.
Do you think her unconventional behavior stems from that fantasy?
Absolutely. As a princess, she believes she can do no wrong. I must say that she's worlds apart from her sister Frances.
Do you know Frances Nolan well?
Yes, rather. Through my treatment of her sister, I've known her for years. Let me say that it is difficult to believe that Miss Frances is capable of murder. She has a quiet, unassuming personality. An act of such direct confrontation would not be at all in keeping with her character.
Were Loretta and Frances close?
I know without a doubt that Miss Frances loves and cares for her sister almost as a parent would a child. Miss Loretta, well, she loves her sister as much as she is capable of love.
Tell us, Dr. Mason, have you determined the cause of Frances Nolan's blackouts?
It's the strangest thing, really. But I examined her thoroughly and found nothing physically wrong. She could not recall receiving a bump in the head, nor did she complain of dizziness. All I could suggest that was perhaps she was overtired and prescribed rest. It remains a complete mystery to me.
We have just a few more questions for you, Mr. Locke, if you don't mind.
Of course not. Anything to help Frances.
We were wondering if you could shed some light on Miss Frances' relationship with Guy Clarendon.
He was only after her money. I tried to tell Frances as much, but she wouldn't hear of it. We had a bit of a row over it. I've been quite upset about the whole thing.
Upset enough to commit murder?
What an outrageous accusation.
There's any question, Mr. Locke.
Preposterous. Besides, I've been on holiday all week, playing cribbage at the annual tournament up at Leeds.
Sounds positively riveting.
Oh, it was.
Their father, Sir Malcolm, left them each a 1/6 share. Several years ago, as soon as she came of age, Miss Loretta divested herself of her stock.
My husband, God rest his soul, gave me that necklace for our 50th wedding anniversary. And woe betide the blighter that took it, I say.
I can certainly understand your consternation, madam. May I assume that you were out the evening it was taken?
Oh, yes, the house was completely empty. Sybil, my housekeeper, and I were attending the mass charity ball at St. Mary's for the benefit of unwed mothers. It wouldn't surprise me if that scoundrel was responsible in that direction as well. Society burglar, indeed. He's of the lower classes, mark my words.
Do you keep your jewels locked up?
Oh, I keep them in a very secret place. A box made to look like a copy of Great Expectations on the bookshelf amidst the other books. Hiram, my late husband, thought of that. But the thief went right to it.
Mr. Clarendon appears to be a frequent depositor.
Yes, but it looks as if he's afraid the money will burn a hole in his bank book if he leaves it in too long.
So, sorry to have kept you waiting, gentlemen. I assume you are inquiring about the Nolan girls.
Yes, we are. How long have you been their solicitor, Mr. Davenport?
Actually, in practice, I am serving that function only for Frances. Loretta has not sought a word of my advice since she came of age and was able legally to get her hands on her trust fund. Had Loretta the presence of mind to follow my good counsel, I'm certain she would be in a far better financial situation today.
Do you recall a meeting with Miss Frances last month when she blacked out?
Well, I did have a very odd meeting with both Miss Frances and Miss Loretta several weeks ago.
How so?
Well, I wouldn't say she blacked out as such, but she did leave rather unexpectedly. We were in the middle of our discussion when I was called out of the office. I was gone not more than 20 minutes. When I returned, Miss Frances had a very strange look in her eyes. She mumbled something and promptly left. Miss Loretta laughed that very disturbing laugh of hers and departed as well.
Poor old Guy. He could be such fun. I'll never forget what a jolly good time we had the night he climbed the fountain at my country estate.
How acrobatic.
You don't know the half of it. It all started with Loretta. It seemed those things always did. Anyway, someone dared her to jump into the fountain. It being March and quite chilly, no one actually thought she would. She did them on better. She jumped straight in and swam to the center, where I have this absolutely dreadful sculpture with a lot of fat water nymphs. It rises some 20 or 30 feet in the air. She climbed it, though. The woman must be part monkey. Then she dove in. After that, it seemed to be the thing to do, so everybody took the plunge. I was the only other one who actually climbed to the top of the fountain, though. By the end of the weekend, half my guests came down with sneezes. Loretta caught pneumonia.
Do you remember a woman who came in recently and purchased a derringer?
Oh, matter of fact, I do, sir. We don't get women in here very often, especially not alone. And I particularly remember that one because she was so pretty and, she looked like she really knew how to have a good time, if you'll pardon the expression.
Do you remember her name?
I should say I do. She repeated it twice whilst I was filling out the order form. Seems like it was very important to her that I get her name right. Let me see, it was, Frances, no, less, well, it was Frances something or other, sir.
You're quite sure the murder weapon was a small caliber pistol?
Quite. I'd also wager to say he'd been shot at very close range.
Ghastly.
Tell us, Sir Jasper, at what time did you receive the body?
Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
And how much time would you judge to have elapsed from the time of the murder?
Well, it's always difficult to be precise in these matters, but I'd venture to say he'd been dead anywhere from 4 to 10 hours.
I say, excuse me, Dr. Murray.
Hello. What? Oh, my, I must have dozed off. Ah, it's you, Whitson. And what are you doing with yourself this afternoon? Or is it evening already? Have I missed my tea?
It's Watson, sir. We're looking into the Clarendon case, and we were wondering...
Clarendon? Ah, I just finished that report when I dozed off. Let me see. Number 301, I believe. Ah, yes. Here it is. Number 103. Clarendon, Guy. Not much, I'm afraid. A hole in the shirt where a small caliber bullet passed into the body. Extensive blood stains. Powder burns indicating a close-range shot. Ah, here's something interesting. On the lower part of the shirt, I found traces of alcohol. Wine, to be exact. Now, I have a good nose for this sort of thing, and I believe it to be an inferior quality Italian red.
It appears as though Guy and Loretta, the terrible twins, will afflict us no more. Loretta must be desolate, what with the loss of a kindred spirit and fellow prankster.
Prankster?
Well, yes, my good fellow. I'll never forget the time. Clarendon poured champagne down the front of Lady Leeds's new Paris gown for the sole purpose of Loretta's amusement.
I would think she must also be distraught at the loss of her lover, not to mention the imprisonment of her sister.
Well, I'm not sure about Loretta's feelings toward her sister, but I do know that Guy and Loretta were not lovers. Though outwardly they made an excellent couple. He, tall, handsome, and from a moneyed family, and she, beautiful, and an heiress in her own right. Yes, it would have been a match made in heaven. But it was a match made in far hotter regions, I suspect.
Francis claims that she and Clarendon were engaged to be married.
Well, that's hard to imagine, him being who he is. Or was, as it were.
Why do you say that?
Well, Guy Clarendon was not at all a desirable sort. He'd all but been disowned by his own father for his compulsive gambling. The utter disregard for other people's money is probably what drew Clarendon and Loretta Nolan together in the first place. After all, she had managed to fritter away almost her entire fortune, unlike her sister Frances, who still had her inheritance, if not her honor, intact.
Oh, that explains it.
What are you driving at, Holmes?
From all I've heard of Clarendon, I suspect his interest in Frances was directed toward her sizable bank account.
We were at a reception at Buckingham Palace for the new head of the China delegation. Upon arriving home, my wife discovered that her favorite ruby earrings were missing. We noticed nothing else out of place. No sign of a search, that is. And none of the servants had heard anything suspicious.
My wife and I were guests at a small dinner party at the home of Otis Richmond. We arrived home sometime after midnight. And as my wife was putting away her finery, she noticed the bracelet was missing from her jewelry box. And we summoned the police immediately.
The servants were questioned?
Oh, they've all been with us for a number of years, and I haven't the slightest suspicion about them. But yes, the police did question them thoroughly. All were in bed asleep by the time we arrived home, and none heard anything untoward.
And nothing else was taken?
Surprisingly not.
Yet you are positive that the bracelet has not simply been misplaced?
No, my wife actually put it on while she was preparing for the evening, and then she decided against it. I saw her put it back in the box.
Where does she keep the box?
In her dressing table, there's a special compartment in the side of it. The box fits in rather neatly.
Sure, I remember Clarendon. He and his lady friend used to stop in here from time to time, usually on their way to Kilgore's gaming parlor or coming back from it. Rumor has it, Clarendon was into Kilgore for a sizable sum.
Do you happen to know how much?
£7,000 was the figure I heard. Got to the point Kilgore wouldn't allow him in the door. Clarendon made a big fuss till Gus Bullock stepped in. Clarendon backed down pretty quick. Don't blame him none. Nobody in their right mind would want to mess with the likes of Gus.
Do you think Bullock was involved in the murder?
Nothing you could tell me about that bloke would surprise me. Anyway, Kilgore makes it clear to Clarendon that he wants his money. Then, a month or so later, Clarendon comes in all smiles, and he and Kilgore getting on like chums. Figure Clarendon must have paid him back. Then, Calvin Leach steps into the picture.
Now, who's Calvin Leach?
Leach deals in what you might call stolen property. Square dealer, too. Give you one half the value of the article.
What does Leach have to do with Clarendon?
Hear ye, hear ye. The Queen's Court stands in session. Mr. Holmes, I understand you've been looking into the murder of Guy Clarendon.
That is correct, my lord.
Would you be so kind as to tell the court who killed Mr. Clarendon? I see. And what was Loretta Nolan's motive for killing Clarendon? Ah, greed. Pure and simple. Now, have you determined why Francis Nolan went to Halliday's?
I have, my lord.
Please inform the court. Not a very sisterly thing to do at all. Is there anything else you wish to report to the court?
Yes, my lord. I believe we've also solved the case of the society burglar.
You don't say. Who is the guilty party?
Remember, we may choose from either the notebook or the directory.
I believe we are already aware of that, Watson.
Guy Clarendon was straight from the upper crust. Why ever did he turn to a life of crime? Congratulations, gentlemen. This was a difficult case.
On the contrary, my lord, it was elementary.
That's what you think. Nonetheless, the good people of London are forever in your debt. We thank you.
My pleasure, my lord.
Well, Watson, we should be very pleased with ourselves on this one.
Yes, indeed, Holmes. 2 cases solved for Scotland Yard, though I doubt that Lestrade will consider himself in our debt. 2? Yes, indeed. First, the society burglar. Clarendon was £7,000 in debt to the gambler Kilgore. Unfortunately, he was in his father's bad graces and he was flat broke.
Do you suppose Kilgore sent Bullock around to rough Clarendon up?
Good deduction, Watson. You're learning. That's why he moved into Halliday's, to escape Gus Bullock.
And to pay off his debts, he took to burglary.
Right you are. He acquired a black sweater, trousers, and a pair of black canvas shoes so as not to be seen or heard in the dead of night. He chose victims of his own class, whose social comings and goings he knew well, and whose homes he'd visited often.
I still don't understand why, after he'd settled in at Halliday's, he changed rooms.
Elementary, my dear Watson. To be at the back of the hotel with a vine-covered trellis conveniently leading in and out of his bedroom window.
Quite so. Positively clever of you.
May I continue?
Oh, please do.
On the 1st of June, Bullock tracked Clarendon down and confronted him in the lobby. Clarendon paid him the £5,000 that was given to him by his father.
But he still owed Kilgore £2,000. And that was the same evening the society burglar struck for the first time.
So pleased you've been paying attention, Watson. Soon after that, Clarendon, Kilgore, and Calvin Leach, a known trafficker in stolen goods, were seen together. Notice, if you will, that 1/2 the value of the first 3 society burglaries is equal to £2,000. Half the value being the price normally paid by Calvin Leach for stolen goods. Notice also that this same amount is equal to the balance of Clarendon's debt to Kilgore.
Fascinating. So with his new vocation, Clarendon now had an easy source of income.
Quite so, as his succeeding bank transactions evidence. On the day after each of the next 3 burglaries, Clarendon made deposits. Everything went along swimmingly, and by June 30th, his debt was paid.
But the tiara was stolen July 1st.
Yes, Watson. Apparently, young Clarendon thought he'd found himself a new vocation. He might have lasted longer at it if he'd chosen something else to steal.
Whatever do you mean, Holmes?
Loretta Nolan's delusion that she was born of royal parentage proved to be his undoing.
If she took it, how did she manage? No one saw her enter or leave.
She came and went the same way Clarendon did, via the trellis. She was armed with a derringer purchased at Escorts in her sister's name. Clarendon returned from his night's work and poured 2 glasses of wine in celebration. That's when Loretta Nolan shot him and took the tiara.
How wicked of her.
Not nearly as wicked as what she did next.
What?
She went to her sister Frances's home and hypnotized her. She then proceeded to instruct her to go to Clarendon's room with the derringer and fire it into the ceiling.
Incriminate her own sister? But why?
If we could determine that precisely, we could start our own institute.
Sick mind, no doubt. But tell me, Holmes, how did Clarendon know the precise locations of each of his victims' jewels?
Excellent question, Watson. Although there is no clear-cut evidence for this, I can only assume that Loretta Nolan must have been in on it, too. The only way Clarendon could have known the locations of the jewels was if the victims themselves had told him where to look. None of them recalls having told anyone, but in fact they did tell someone.
Who?
Loretta Nolan. She managed to hypnotize each of the ladies whose jewels were stolen and got them to reveal the precise locations of the family treasures.
And left them with no memory of having done so.
Precisely.
Astounding, Holmes.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
May we be of some assistance, Inspector Smythe?
General Farnsworth Armstead, one of the 6 surviving Waterloo Tontine ticket holders, has been murdered.
Waterloo Tontine?
The Waterloo Tontine was a lottery of sorts, Watson. It was set up in 1815 to aid the veterans of the Battle of Waterloo. Wellington's victory over Napoleon.
Yes, of course. I knew that.
Quite an ingenious plan on the part of the founders. £1 bought a ticket in the name of some young relative. The ticket proceeds amounted to over £1 million. Half went immediately to veterans and their families for medical and hardship expenses.
What became of the other half?
It all went into an account at the Bank of England, where it's been collecting interest all these years.
Very clever. And how does one win this prize?
Simply by outliving all the other ticket holders.
And now you say one of them has been murdered. Very suspicious. Who are the remaining 5?
The oldest is Captain Robert Jurgens, age 82. Then there are Anita and Clara Thomas, who are 80-year-old twins. William Rowland is 79, and Peter Dudley is 77. Poor General Armstead was the youngest at 74.
Seems as if he would have had the best chance to outlive the others.
I recall reading something in the Times about a big to-do involving the Tontine survivors on the 18th.
That's correct. The Waterloo anniversary banquet at the Langham Hotel.
Why is the name Armstead familiar?
He was a noted art collector, I believe. He also authored a well-known book, Treasures of the Conquerors.
Quite right. At the time of his death, General Armstead was working on a revised edition for his publisher, Norgate and Company. It was to contain an entirely new chapter on a fabulous diamond called the Polar Star, which at one point belonged to Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother. The general had new information which traced the gem to its present owner.
Tell me about the circumstances of General Armstead's death.
Oh, yes, of course. Well, let me see. At 10 o'clock this morning, the general's valet, David Sennett, admitted a call to the general's study. Sennett says he did not know the man. He was elderly and spoke with a French accent. Senate told him the general never saw anyone in the morning while he was at work. The gentleman insisted that if Armstead read the letter he had with him, he would make an exception. And so it was. Senate took the letter in, Armstead read it, and went quite pale. He told Senate to let the gentleman in. Sensing something amiss, Senate dawdled in the area of the study for the next 15 minutes or so. Then he heard the distinct sound of swordplay. He tried to enter the study, but found the door locked. Then he heard the crash of breaking glass. He raced to the kitchen and out the back door to enter the study from the garden. By the time he got there, the caller had vanished, and the general was leaning heavily against a shattered display case of military miniatures. Before Senate could assist him, he dropped a saber from his hand and fell over dead.
And I take it the letter, which so upset the general, was nowhere to be found.
Correct, Mr. Holmes.
Well, we shall put our brains and our feet to the task.
Found the general leaning over the display case. He had his saber in hand, the one that usually resides above the fireplace.
I understand he was a collector of military figures.
Yes, the display in the study shows the last great British charge that swept the French from Waterloo.
Is there any significance to the fact that the figure of Napoleon is facing backwards?
How strange. Perhaps I should go and set it straight.
No, don't touch it. Not until the police have concluded their investigation.
Oh, yes, Dale.
Do I detect a note of hostility?
I must admit we did not get on very well. But I might say that Mrs. Armstead did not get on very well with anyone, including the general.
You mean they didn't marry for love?
Hardly. Lord Fitch, Mrs. Armstead's father, arranged the match. Her dowry was very generous. Lord Fitch would have paid any amount to ensure that he would not be left with a spinster daughter, especially such a nasty one.
If there was no love lost between them, why did he keep her portrait in his study?
Actually, it was put up there to needle Mrs. Armstead's brother, the present Lord Fitch. He never approved of the marriage. Even after her death, they were involved with mutual business affairs. They jointly owned stock or some such thing.
Tell me, do you know what the general was doing at the time the intruder arrived?
Yes, he was working on the new section of his book, the part that concerns the gem, the Polar Star.
Ah, but you must see Philippe perform. My nephew is an artist, a wonder. He manages to portray the Emperor Napoleon from age 19 until his last days on the island of Savarne. You would swear 5 different actors playing the part, but no, it is only Philippe aging before your eyes. At 48, he's the toast of the continent.
You seem rather young to be the uncle of a 48-year-old man.
I am but 8 years older than Philippe, though I can assure you I am his uncle. You might say that our family has a history of late arrivals. Philippe's father was 25 years older than myself, and Philippe's poor sister was 15 years older than he.
Why do you say poor?
She died many years ago under tragic circumstances. In fact, her mother was so upset over her daughter's death that she was put into an asylum. We received word yesterday from the asylum that she had also passed away. It upset Philippe very much, resurrecting old ghosts, as you might say. But we have been playing for enthusiastic audiences for several weeks. As we say in the business, the show must go on. And Philippe is a trooper. He would never allow it to affect his performance.
Can you tell us where Philippe Arnaud is this morning? We should like very much to meet him.
Well, he is not here now. Our company is staying at the Grand Hotel. However, I believe today he is visiting the National Gallery. But if you would come back this evening, I will have tickets awaiting, and after the show, you're welcome to come backstage and meet him.
How fortunate that Inspector Lestrade authorized the hotel manager to allow us to search Philippe Arnaud's room.
Perhaps we can return the favor and solve a case for him someday. Today, for example. Let's look around.
How strange that a man who requires a cane would leave without it.
Perhaps he doesn't require it.
For walking.
Look here at the handle.
Well, that could certainly give a fellow a start.
Precisely, Watson. Look here. It appears to be a letter.
Looks quite old. It's addressed to Captain Armstead, 12th Hussars.
Shall I read it?
Please do.
Dearest, how I hated you for leaving me, but the child, our child, eased my heartache and muted the hate. Now my sweet baby is dead. How cruel that the innocent must suffer for the sins of others. Now I have nothing. Now I am nothing. I cannot bear the pain. Goodbye, I love you still, Fleurette. How tragic.
Why, perhaps this is the very letter that the General read.
Good thinking, Watson.
Hear ye, hear ye. The Queen's court stands in order. I see we have the pleasure of your company today, Mr. Holmes. I understand you've been investigating the murder of General Farnsworth Armstead.
That's correct, my lord.
A brilliantly logical deduction, Holmes.
Thank you, my lord.
Now tell us, why was the general killed? Now tell me, gentlemen, what was the general trying to say when he turned around the figure of Napoleon? Rather clever of the old boy now, wasn't it?
Indubitably. A man who keeps his wits about him to the last has my undying admiration.
I was wondering, just for the record, could you tell us what the general used to call his wife? Congratulations, gentlemen. This was a difficult case.
On the contrary, my lord, it was elementary.
That's what you think. Nonetheless, the good people of London are forever in your debt. We thank you.
My pleasure, my lord.
You say you've come up with a solution, and yet you sit there calmly cleaning your meerschaum. Please, Holmes, tell me what you've uncovered.
Of course, Watson. It's quite simple, really. The most intriguing fact about this murder was the method. Mr. Sennett's report that he heard the distinct sound of swordplay struck me as most odd. It suggested an affair of honor. At General Armstead's home, my suspicions were confirmed. The old letter addressed to Captain Armstead, a rank he'd held some 40 years ago, suggested that it must have concerned something from the past, something that was clearly upsetting to him. That was the reason for the duel.
But how can you be so sure there was a duel?
Simple reasoning, my dear Watson. The general had time to place his chair against the wall, climb upon it, and retrieve a saber. The murderer allowed him to arm himself. A duel is the only event that fits with the facts.
Are you sure the caller carried a sword? I thought all he had with him was a carpet bag and a cane.
Perhaps it only appeared to be a cane.
Ah, yes.
The intruder was described as an old man, yet he left the premises over an 8-foot wall. Clearly, he was in disguise and carried off the ruse with enough expertise to completely fool the general's manservant. The carpet bag must have been used as the receptacle of the disguise when it was no longer needed.
Positively clever of you, Holmes. But what made you think it was Arnaud?
Well, since we were looking for someone adept at the art of disguise, Gerard's mention of the actor Philippe Arnaud struck a chord. Also, Arnaud plays Napoleon. No small coincidence.
What are you getting at, Holmes?
When the general turned round at the figure of Napoleon, he was trying to tell us that his murderer was Napoleon. Or rather, the actor playing Napoleon, Philippe Arnaud.
So Arnaud killed the general to avenge his long-dead sister's honor. Ah, well, unlike most of our cases, this motive was closer to the heart than to the pocketbook.
Quite so, Watson. When Arnaud's sister Fleurette was an impressionable young girl, she fell madly in love with the dashing English captain. When he left, she took her own life.
So pathetic.
Wait, there's more. Fleurette's grief-stricken mother went mad and was sent into an asylum. Thus, in the twinkling of an eye, little Philippe Arnaud, who was but a child himself, lost both his mother and his sister.
So sad. I'm sure he was too young to understand the circumstances that caused it.
Yes, but 4 decades later it all became clear when he found a letter written by his sister. It yielded an explanation and a name. Armstead. He came to London armed with that letter, and a sword came.
But he was here for several weeks before he did the deed.
Yes, and he might not have done it at all had it not been for the news of his mother's death. That was the final blow. He went straight away to the General's home to take his revenge. Voila.
Positively brilliant, Holmes. How do you do it?
This pipe cleaner, of course.